for the entire audience, while we're approaching the end of the day, we have the key session by Ankit, which Sreedhar will take us through. But before that, I want to announce that there have been like many questions that came through the day about videos, etc., which will be there, and there are some other announcements that we'll be making towards the end. So please do tune in for the closing note after Ankit's session. Yeah, Sreedhar, we are good whenever you are good to start.
Great. Thank you, Gautami. Hi, everyone. I have the pleasure of inviting Ankit to this event. Thank you, Ankit. So, as you all know, you must have read about Postman and the recent fundraise and so on. It's a phenomenal journey since they've formally launched in October 2014 as a company, and now in 2020, in the 5 short years or so. As a personal note, I came across Postman back in 2016. That too as a tool that as doing one of my team reviews. That's how the team was using Postman, and they were using that to demonstrate their progress and so on. No, that was my first introduction to Postman, and since then I've seen that a lot of the teams within my own organization were using Postman, and so it's one of those classic examples of customer advocacy, I guess. So that advocacy is now reflected in the results and the growth that Postman is showing. Would love to learn from you, Ankit, in terms of how you all went about building such an awesome organization. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Can you guys hear me just fine?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, cool. Quickly sharing my screen. All right. So I'm assuming you guys can see my screen.
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Perfect. Okay. Awesome. So guys, thank you so much for having me. So it's an absolute pleasure. I spoke at SaaSBOOMi earlier in Jan when I had gone to Chennai, and it was just a beautiful event, and I learned a lot by just interacting with the community there. So thanks again for having me again, and it's been a great conference and events that have been organized by our team. So just a quick introduction from my side, right? So my name is Ankit, and I'm one of the founders and the CTO here at Postman. And today I'm really excited to talk about something that I'm extremely passionate about. So not a lot of people know that Postman as a company, though formally existed since October of 2014, but as a product has existed since early 2012. And I've been associated with Postman since the very beginning. I wrote the first version of the auth plugins, and super buggy, I might add, at that point in time. But continued my engagement with the product, and in 2014 October, formally started out as a full-fledged organization. And of course, I'm extremely passionate about APIs. So in case you're not familiar, Postman is the world's leading API-first development platform. It's a collaborative platform for modern software where development begins with an API. Now, Postman is used by more than 10 million developers in more than 500,000 organizations around the world. And that's pretty, fascinating growth for us. I mean, we learned a lot by growing the organization. We learned so much from the community, and it's been an absolute honor, this whole journey and how we have, reached this point. We still have so long to go. As a company itself, Postman has grown. I mean, we started out, Abhinav and me, Abhinav's our CEO, and we started out in 2014, and now Postman, of course, is over the last 6 years, we have now just over 200 people that we employ across 5 continents and 7 countries. So coming to the topic at hand, which is designing your organization for impact. So today I'll talk about our journey and the conscious steps that we took while on that journey to design and redesign an organization for the aforementioned impact. And I'll keep this talk as a combination of the theoretical and the anecdotal. I know this might be a little dense, and probably after a whole day of listening to folks talk, you're probably hoping to wind down with a light, feel-good story. This is not it, just a big caveat on top. So, and the reason for that is because some of the best talks that I've learned from are those where I continue to learn so much more after the talk itself was done. So what I'm aiming at least to share today is a collection of mental models and frameworks that I've learned from and applied with varying degrees of success over the years. And these have helped us scale the organization and navigate change in times of high growth. So I will include detailed references wherever applicable so that you can deep dive and continue to learn from later. Honestly, I would have loved if someone had pointed me to all of these frameworks in the relatively early stages of Postman. So I hope this will turn out to be useful for you. And one last thing, I mean, at heart, I'm an engineer, and a lot of the vocabulary that you may hear today will be borrowed from the engineering parlance. So the one thing at the outset, though, I wanted to point out was an important caveat. So this is a framework, 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100 and beyond. It's a framework that I really like because it allows you to prioritize what's important and define your thought process in your playbooks, depending on which stage at the journey that you're in. And one thing you'll note in this framework is that it actually does not include any unit, 0 to 1 of what, right? And it kind of depends on like how you want to define your business and the kind of business that you're in. So for example, typically SaaS companies, the 0 to 1 problem may mean $0 to $1 million in annual recurring revenue. Whereas for a consumer business, it may be the first 10,000 users, or for an enterprise business, it may be one enterprise relying on your solution in production. And that's kind of the keyword here, relying on in production, and they are better because of it. And each organization should have priorities depending on where you are in your journey. And it's one of the hardest things and the most important things to do as a founder is to manage these inflection points at which you transition from one stage to the next. 0 to 1 is when your absolute priority needs to be on one thing and one thing only, which is finding product market fit. Nothing else matters. We were not, invested and deeply thinking about organizational design principles when we were solving the 0 to 1 problem for Postman. And a lot of the things that I'll be talking about today are what we learned and applied either while transitioning from the 1 to 10 to the 10 to 100 stage, or while we were in the 10 to 100 stage. And some of the things we applied earlier than we should have, some that were later than we should have, and that's absolutely fine, as long as you're cognizant of where you are and are able to identify what works for you. There's one excellent blog on managing these inflection points for teams. It's by Seth Blank, and I highly recommend checking it out if you have time. All right, so with that very important caveat out of the way, let's first talk about this one word that I highlighted earlier, which is design. So the first thing is there's no such thing as no design. No design is a fallacy. And although Douglas Martin's comments here are not specifically about software design, they are still applicable to organizational design or any system design in general. Design is inevitable. The alternative to good design is bad design, not no design at all. And honestly, like if you have 3 founders and you haven't thought about what designing your organization means, you probably have 3 different designs that are competing against each other. And often people talk about good design and bad design. And yeah, so just one second, yeah. So often people talk about good design and bad design, and organizations honestly are hard to refactor as they grow. The components of an organization, unlike software, which by the way in itself is pretty hard, are people, which are the slowest entities to respond to change. And one hard learning for me has always been that people only start listening when you're actually tired of saying it, and probably by the 6th or 7th time. So if we subscribe to the notion that there's no such thing as no design, what you're fundamentally left with is bad design. And bad design is expensive. And a well-designed organization for the stage that you are in yields considerable competitive advantage. One word that I like that closely relates to good is effective. And in my mind is a much more accurate one. And what we should strive for in organizational design is effective design. And that's what I'll use henceforth in my vocabulary in this talk. So effective design is one that meets the needs of the organization to the extent that A, it can distinguish itself from other organizations, and B, it brings together all these outliers and misfits that all fit together, aligned by the company's values, and makes them effective at their job. Effective design forces the organization to understand and codify what it must excel at. And when I think about this, right, I always like to think about organizations as products. And I'm a product guy. Like it's reasoning about things in terms of products makes me able to comprehend and think about what things need to be done. So an organization, in my opinion, is a living, breathing entity that has consumers for whom interfaces need to be thoughtfully designed. And if I had to think of product management elimination tournament consisting of problem discovery, problem selection, solution validation. Problem discovery is where you uncover the possible problems that you want to work on within your organization and the parts of the organization which you need to fix. Selection is where you filter out all those problems that you may see or uncover and bring them down into a viable subset. And you validate the solution to ensure that your approach to solving those problems works as effectively as possible. And if you do a good job at all these three phases, you win the luxury of doing it all again, but this time with more complexity and scope. And that's what you always need to do. Design and redesign the organization as the constraints of the organization itself evolve. And when I start reasoning in terms of these product principles, one framework that we prescribe heavily to within Postman is jobs to be done. So jobs to be done was defined by the late Harvard professor, Clayton Christensen, who's pretty much a legend when it comes to tech and business. And it's a very simple idea. All jobs to be done talks about is that your objective when building products is to make better consumers, not better products. And a good area where you think about this is if you think about cameras, right? So if you look at the whole conversation on how cameras themselves has evolved in the last 12 years, the objective is to make better photographers, not better cameras. And that is why iPhones and high-end Android phones are probably have won the war against some of the Kodaks and the Nikons of the world. And much like that, your organization product has your employees as your consumers, and your objective is to make them more effective at their job by putting the right people in the right place with the problem statements that challenge them just above the level that they're capable of solving. And when you are running an organization, does your team know why they are doing what they're supposed to be doing? At Postman, what we realized was that the more we documented and the more we communicated the why, the lesser we needed to communicate over time. People would come close to the right answer on their own, and empowering your team to think is how you achieve exponential growth. And the way to do that is to tell them and reiterate the why constantly, not just that this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it. Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to create this impact? And this has been like this golden circle is if you start reasoning about things in this circle, you suddenly realize that you are basically making everybody else your partners and not your employees, and letting people take better decisions. And that is how exponential growth is typically something that we have seen being achieved. So coming back to design for a second. So we'll reason it in two frames now going forward: strategic design and tactical design. So strategic design, and these terminologies are borrowed from this thing called as domain-driven design, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So strategic design is much like using broad brush strokes as you start out to paint. You basically highlight what is strategically important to your business, how you divide the work up by importance, how do you integrate systems as needed. Whereas when you get into a tactical design, it's like using like a thin brush where you paint out the finer details, which executes the strategic decision that you have taken as you get into the weed of things. So all of these frameworks and constructs we'll reason about under these two categories going forward. So let's start about talking about some of the strategic tools and frameworks that you can use while you think about designing your organization. So the first and the foremost is values. Values are the bedrock of your organization. Values denote what you stand for. And if you look at this slide, this is me, by the way. So this is when Abhinav, our CEO, and I were literally in the process of starting out Postman, the company, and used to work together in a one-bedroom apartment in Indranagar in Bangalore, literally side by side. So that's my table, that's Abhinav's table next to me. And at that point in time, I had just moved to Bangalore in September of 2014, and I was using this bookshelf as a work table. What we didn't have were proper tables to work on at that point in time, but what we did create on that day was a culture code. A code with which Abhinav and I reasoned that, okay, this is how we will make consistent decisions, and it will guide us as we continue to take decisions going forward. Values are important. Values are what brings a bunch of misfits together. Values are what binds people within the organization to solve its unique mission and vision. Values guide how we hire, whom we hire, how we grow people, and how we stay true to what we stand for. Values have to be inherent and sacrosanct. You cannot compromise on them, either for convenience or for short-term economic gain. And the one thing that I've never really comprehended, but I've seen this in practice is, founders don't often do it. And my very, very strong opinion is that this is something that founders need to do. Values are not a marketing tool, and it's definitely not something that you should outsource or hire a VP of marketing to build out for you. Values are a reflection of the founders, of who they are, because if it is not, you will soon be inconsistent with them if they don't embody who you are. And that culture code that we had created back in 2014 is what evolved to become our values. And even though the core remained the same, what we added were behaviors, the good behaviors and the not so good behaviors. Good is where we wanted to encourage people to do more of, but the not so good is what we wanted people to encourage to stay away from. And the common mistake with values is often just to come up with these, put them up on walls and forget about it, right? The challenge is, how do you get them to really mean something? How do you live them regularly? And honestly, there's no silver bullet for this, but I'm going to quickly reference what Postman stands for. And I will reference them throughout the talk to see the many ways in which we utilize and reinforce these values within the organization. Postman's values are honestly just codified versions of who Abhinav and I really are. We both read a lot. We always have, and we have had like an insatiable desire to constantly keep learning. And I think as you go through this talk, you'll probably see more and more of that. We love constraints. Constraints, in our opinion, lead to better solutions. And if you don't have constraints, there never will be an ideal solution. Constraints give us the ability to ship value all the time, which is what we need to do as a growing startup. Even within each other, we never demanded implicit trust, but we earned it over time by being transparent, by being empathetic, and by taking ownership and delivering on it. And that is how we earned each other's trust, and we continue to earn trust of other people within the organization, and other people within the organization continue to earn our trust. And finally, we all celebrate wins together as much as we do not assign blame to individuals in case something goes wrong. And I'll be honest, creating a culture is hard. Keeping it intact as you grow is even harder. And it is something, that needs to be a part of everything that you do, because it is the backbone of your organization. And do not delay this to when you are of a certain size, as I've seen a lot of companies do. Like I've heard conversations like, oh, we are 50 people now, maybe we need a culture. No, this is one of those 0 to 1 design problems that you need to be solving for. Okay, the second strategic tool that I wanted to talk about is the inverse Conway maneuver. Now, this was something that I discovered in my research while I was solving a supposedly technical problem around microservices. I warned you guys, I'm an engineer, so a lot of parlance coming from there. So back in 2018, we had a moderately complex microservices architecture, which had all the malaise of dependencies and couplings and roadmaps not shipping. And the solution itself was not very obvious. And I tried a lot of technical solutions to the problem. And the first thing that I went to when I was trying to solve that particular problem was this whole construct of microservice dependencies. So I came across this incredible book, Building Microservices by Sam Newman, who I recently found out is a big Postman fan. So that was definitely good validation, which outlined the principles of microservices. So the first one, which talks about modeled around business domain, led me to something called as Conway's Law. So Conway's Law was made popular by Fred Brooks in his inimitable classic, The Mythical Man Month. So Melvin Conway, back in 1967, suggested that any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. Now, not the most easiest thing for me to understand when I read it the first time, but the more I thought about this in the context of Postman, the more it started making sense. And it was really interesting because what I did just to validate this theory was that I opened up one of the code bases that we have for one of the more relatively complex systems that we had built out, and also opened up the way our seating charts at our office changed. So when we moved from like a single bedroom to an apartment with 3 bedrooms with 4 people sitting in each room, and as people moved from rooms to rooms, you could see how the code itself was evolving based on the communication that was happening in that microcosm of people interacting within that specific room. And it was awesome to see that the office layout and people sitting and where they sat in the office and the code decisions that we took had strong correlations, whether from 1 bedroom to an apartment with 3 bedrooms to an office with 2 floors. And this was like a fundamental eye-opener and not something that I thought about at that point in time. So basically, Conway's Law asserts that organizations are constrained to produce application designs, which are copies of their communication structures. And the reason why it's law, because it has been seen across organizations of multiple sizes and geographies and all different variables that you can think of. So ThoughtWorks, as recently as 2014, came up with a proposal to kind of hack this Conway's law and leverage it to your advantage. And they called it the inverse Conway maneuver. So the basic premise is that if the technological architecture will display isomorphism with your organizational structure, why not design your organization and its communication structures to promote the desired technical architecture? This honestly was a revelation, something I'd never thought of earlier, and obviously probably would not have on my own. And but now the question was, what desired technical architecture? And that led me to this concept called as domain-driven design. So Martin Fowler, on his amazing blog on ThoughtWorks, wrote about domain-driven design. And it is probably the most effective tool that I found in organizational design for our specific context. So domain-driven design is actually an architectural pattern. It's not an organizational design construct, which was written by or published by Eric Evans in 2004, where he focused on how to break down complex systems into modular, manageable structures. And if you really think about it, like an organization is also like a system, and slightly, if you squint your eyes a little bit, there's a correlation that I'm getting towards. So, and this is also, by the way, an answer that you'll typically find when somebody asks you a question that how do you break down these large monolithic applications into microservices or more modular architectures. And one thing I'll highlight before I get into the weeds of domain-driven design is that this is something that should be used only for problems that have moderate to high complexity. It is absolutely an overkill and will definitely cause more problems than it will solve for lower complexity levels. And the reason for that is because it's complex. It is a complex enough topic that I will definitely not get into the details of. As you can see on the screen, first time I read all of these things, I didn't understand a word of it. And it took more than a few readings to get to that point. But so I'll still leave references scattered here for you to peruse later in case you are interested in the topic. But I'll just touch upon what is relevant for this conversation, right? So if you assume that your organization solves a bunch of problems for different unique personas, so a domain is kind of like a slice of those problems. The definition of which qualifies as what qualifies as a slice comes from business and not technical concerns. Or simply put, you look at all the problems that your organization is solving for, and not have everyone within your organization solve for all those problems in an M cross N fashion. Instead, what you do is slice those problems around business needs and create areas of focus for your team to excel in. Or in other words, domain-driven design advocates modeling based on the reality of business. A domain is also called as a problem space, where you advocate who is facing this set of problems, and I'm talking about end consumers. Why is it a problem in the first place? How do they currently solve this problem? What are the jobs that they're trying to do in their life, putting it back to jobs to be done? And as a company, you have now probably expressed a desire to go ahead and solve these problems, right? So how do you go about doing that? And coming back to where we started in early 2019, our systems have definitely become complex and intertwined, much commonly or colloquially known as dependency hell. And it always required expensive cross-team collaboration, which was fundamentally killing our agility. And the solution to this, fascinatingly, at least fascinating to me, wasn't a technical one, but it was centered around organizational design and pretty much inverse Conway maneuver that implemented the domain-driven design architectural pattern. And I'll be honest, it required a complex reorganization to get this whole idea rolling. It wasn't easy because you are fundamentally communicating complex concepts, and that wasn't easy. Neither was executing it. And actually, if anybody's interested in how to do this, An Elegant Puzzle, one of my favorite books from Bill Larson, has an excellent section on how to manage reorganizations, and I highly recommend checking that out. So after creating these slices of these organizations, these domains or problem spaces, or these focus areas, what we did was we also created these cross-functional slices of the organization along those domain boundaries and called it a squad. So if you see here, a squad is typically a cross-functional mission-driven team. So in our case, it is made up of two parts, the build and the communicate. The build part is typically where you have product design, engineering, and the communicate part is, in our cases, developer advocacy, product marketing, solution engineering. And it's a cross-functional, mission-driven team who's then given resources to take ownership and deliver on those domain problems for their end consumers. Understand who your consumers are, what their needs are, what their jobs should be done, and make them better at their job. And these squads communicate using the same language. These squads are designed to be autonomous. And they, of course, what this did in theory was reduced cross-team collaboration and made these entities, these cross-functional slices of your organization, responsible from concept to cash, or from identifying the problem to going solving it and generating revenue from it. And these squads obviously work if they win together. And one very, very important thing to note here is that this particular solution would not have worked. And now that it's been more than a year, I can say it worked pretty spectacularly. But this was something that would not have worked without a strong foundation of our values that we spend so much energy on, and our culture that allowed for structures like these to be effective, which got me to this extremely important realization, is that the structures that you create within the organization and the culture that you promote end up being isomorphic. So for each squad, we track the progress through multiple stages, aligning it to business impact, from the inception of the squad to a visionary state in which you are pushing the industry itself forward with new ideas. So Spotify is actually one company that pioneered the vocabulary around squads. And I recommend reading more about how a similar concept may work in a 2,000+ person organization. This whole concept also has origin in Amazon's 2 pizza tools. And to a large extent, what we did was we borrowed the vocabulary and some concepts and applied them to our own unique context. Again, outlining the golden circle and why that is important, and why it is important to understand the why and not directly borrow the what and how from different organizations, because that will lead to solutions that may not make sense for your unique context of the organization. And one more thing is that these mission-driven teams are also designed to be transient. So once they have fulfilled their mission and made better users, they may be disbanded to go focus on other problem domains. So from the strategic, let's get into the tactical, where we look at some of the tools and frameworks to paint the finer details of implementation. And just to make this explicit, like, obviously, since I'm talking about the 10 to 100 problems, organizations are, we explicitly talk differently about organizations and teams. And an organization is a group of teams that work together, just for definition purposes from this point onwards. And one of the hardest things to do as an organization scales is to achieve alignment, both within organization and within teams. And 2 tools that I've found to be the most effective to achieve this alignment are OKRs and vision documents. So OKR is a great tool for organization alignment for how teams and individuals align with organizational goals. And I'll talk more. I'm sure a lot of you probably have heard about and use OKRs, which is great. It's also important to keep an eye on that, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But this vision document was an excellent tool that I discovered recently to achieve alignment within these squads and these teams, both at inception and in steady state. And these vision documents also eventually roll up and provides inputs to OKRs. These are not mutually exclusive tools. So OKRs, they're a great tool for organizational alignment. They were adapted from, if I remember correctly, management by objectives or management by results. I don't know if they're equivalent, by Intel's legendary CEO, Andrew Grove. And he first outlined this in his book, High Output Management. So Intel fundamentally pioneered the concept of OKRs, but Google took them to another level. So John Doerr, who wrote this fascinating book, Measure What Matters, was an early investor who brought OKRs to Google. And Larry Page loved it so much, it helped scale the company from 40 to 60,000 plus. In fact, one thing that I had recently read about was that at a point in time early when Larry Page did not believe in management at all, so Google had folks who were line managing 150 plus people and aligning the whole team through OKRs. And that specific team that I'm talking about, by the way, for the record, was responsible for scaling Google's entire infrastructure and led to the rise of MapReduce and BigQuery, which I think was just phenomenal. So at Postman itself, we started using OKRs right around the time when we did the squad reorganization, because we realized that now that we had transitioned from a top-down organization where objectives were being driven by either the founders or the early employees or the leadership in the team, but to now, where squads were taking more ownership of how they will deliver value to their end consumers. And we found OKRs to be the most effective tool to achieve this bottoms-up alignment of autonomous squads with organizational top-level strategic goals. And because OKRs are lightweight and simple, they enable frequent goal setting. The most modern and the most effective organizations actually do goal setting and reevaluations on a monthly cadence right now, not annual, sometimes not even quarterly. And you look at some of the best companies that are growing and brewing right now in the Silicon Valley, that's what they are doing. Having these cadences at a monthly level because you need to move fast and take action. And OKRs, just by their ability to be lightweight, allow you to do that. So in accordance with, in alignment with the OKRs, the second tool that I highly recommend is a vision document. It is one of the most effective tools that I've found to align teams with long-term objectives. It is something that I recommend be done for each team, not just the organization. And at Postman, we are cross-functional, mission-driven squads actually use these vision statements to define their mission and constantly validate against it. And these vision documents are required because now one of the things that you'll also notice is the value when it comes to hiring, because if these things are codified, the team knows what they have to align themselves against. It becomes more possible to actually go ahead and convince external people to come in because everybody within the team is aligned on what the overall objective of that team is. And not having that actually leads to more confusion than I have found acceptable. So typically a vision document is a very simple tool. It breaks down into these 4 sections: the vision statement, the value proposition, the capabilities, and the constraints. I discovered this tool in this amazing book, which I highly recommend, called An Elegant Puzzle by Will Larson. So a vision statement is fundamentally nothing but a 1 to 2 sentence, like aspirational and also an inspirational statement. Something that brings a team together and motivates them that, yes, this is what I'm going to be doing, and this is how I'm going to be creating my impact in the world. Because, right, so for example, like for the data team at Postman, and what we do is that the vision statement is to enable all the functions within Postman with the power of data and insights, allowing us to take high impact decisions quickly with confidence. And there are a lot of very carefully chosen words here, because all of these help us dictate that when we introduce a new system or a new process or a new interface for the rest of the organization to interact with the data team, we always go back and reference to the vision statement. Is that what we had intended to do, right? The second section is the value proposition. How will you as a team be valuable to your users and your company? How will you make them better at their job? The consumers may be internal or external, and again, aligns with jobs to be done. What are the capabilities that your team needs to deliver on that value proposition for your end consumers? And finally, and this is the hard one to fill out for most people, is what are the constraints that are limiting me today? And assuming those constraints were to loosen or be resolved for in the future, what do I expect to be constrained by in the future? And constraints, I mean, you know, our alignment with our value of embrace constraints. Right? Constraints are good. Oftentimes when a team writes this document, I have found that it unblocks a part of that brain in the team. It removes the ambiguity around why you would not be able to ship something. And that level of clarity has just phenomenally revolutionized the way that we operate within Postman by just this one-page single document that a team gets alignment on. And more, when we go towards bottom-up organizations which are aligning with top-down strategic goals, teams' autonomy comes from occupying tools like the OKRs and the vision document. One caveat, an important point to note here, is that each system or tool needs to be designed for evolution. And your organization may evolve, your team may evolve, your constraints may evolve. And that means that you may have to evolve the vision of your team. And these documents should never be designed to be rigid. And you should always be looking for signals wherever they may be coming from to realize that something has solved its purpose and needs to be updated. So moving on to the second set of tools around tactical, and that is the conundrum of hiring. So hiring often comes up as the hardest thing for teams to do, and also one that teams spend a large chunk of their time in. And what I feel is that given the fact that disproportionate amount of time that you're spending hiring and thinking about hiring or getting frustrated about hiring if you do not design interview loops, that whole process ends up being reductive and leads to a lot of time wastage. And coming back to, the thing that I had spoken about, no design, if you haven't designed for this and you have like 15 people taking interviews, you probably have 15 different designs floating around. And the people who are applying to your organization are interfacing with probably 15 different interfaces. And that's not okay, because they will see the confusion or the incoherence within the organization will invariably leak out of the interface that you're creating from within the organization. So if we start out, let's talk about two frameworks. The first one, again from Elegant Puzzle, highly recommend this one, is the 4 states of a team. So if you talk to any team within any organization and ask what their number one concern is, the answer, I feel at least like you unequivocally get is hiring. So the team is understaffed, and only if I had more people, I would be able to change the world. And while I believe that hiring is a very important approach to growing organizations, I also believe that we reach out for it just a little too often. And hiring, just to be clear, right? And it's like not everybody realizes this, but hiring doesn't immediately add value. It takes time and concerted effort to run a hiring process. And it takes time for someone who comes into your organization to become effective. And when a person does join your team, it takes time for the team itself to re-gel or reorient, and it reduces velocity in the short term. And too often I see managers identifying hiring as the reason for the team's poor performance. And the more I saw this, the more I realized that, okay, this is probably needs thinking, or at least a conscious approach towards, okay, why do we hire? When do we hire? And when do we look at hiring rapidly versus incrementally and so on? Because it cannot be something that you just do. And the reason why I love this framework is because it allows me to think about how to approach hiring tactfully. And it's not something that I am doing because I don't know what else to do to improve the performance of the team. So a team can typically be slotted into this continuum of 4 states. If I'm in the falling behind state, and that it's important for teams to also recognize where they are in this sort of framework. So if I'm in the falling behind state, if in each week, if my backlog is longer than the week before, and I'm talking about some of the signals that you will recognize to realize where your team is at each stage, right? So typically, in the falling behind stage, people are working hard, but not making much progress. The general morale is low. The users are vocally dissatisfied. In the second state, you're in treading water. Your team is probably able to get the critical work done, but is not able to start paying down the debts or start major new projects. Basically just getting things done, but just about. The morale is slightly higher than when you're falling behind, but folks are still working incredibly hard to make that happen. In the third state of this continuum, repaying debt, you're probably able to pay down these technical and managerial debts, and you're kind of starting to see the benefit of these debt repayments. And the good part about being in this state is because each piece of debt that you repay gives you time to repay more debt. It's kind of like that compounding interest effect. And finally, the state where you ideally want your teams to be innovating. This is the point at which technical debt is sustainably low, the morale is generally high, and the majority of the work is satisfying new user needs, building new functionality, adding and making better users fundamentally. And teams ideally want to move in this direction from this continuum, from falling behind to innovating, but the entropy around the teams always drags them backward. So how do you go about transitioning between these states if you do recognize which state you are in? And this is a combination of what I see in the framework plus what I see work at Postman. And I realized that what you need is both system level and technical fixes to accomplish this. So let's say you are in the falling behind state. And this is the point at which I always encourage is that if you're falling behind and if your team is understaffed, quickly hire people and give them the time to quickly gel so that the team starts moving into treading water. And it's important at this point in time to inject optimism by identifying and finding some easy wins for the team to celebrate. And tactically, as a manager or a leader of a team, it is important to also set the expectations with the users at this point in time. By doing this, you may transition into treading water, where the important thing is that you consolidate the team's efforts into finishing things, not into doing a lot of things in parallel and give that illusion of work happening, but actually finishing more things and seeing the impact of it. And the important thing as a leader at this point in time would be to reduce some of the concurrent work that exists. The tactical part here is that you transition towards the winning together strategy, not celebrating personal wins. Finally, you move on to the repaying debt stage, at which the system fix at this point in time is that you find more time and somehow you figure out a way to find more time within the team and finding the space for this compounding effect that I mentioned to kick in. And finally, at the innovating stage, the important thing is to make sure that you maintain enough slack within the team so the team can build quality into its work, and also have certain amount of instrumentation or metrics that observe all of these signals, which realize which part of this continuum that you exist, right? So two important things to keep in mind if you do sort of start implementing this framework is that these fixes are slow. And I've gone through this a few times now, and these fixes take time, and you need to have the gumption to go give it that time. And secondly, adding new individuals to a team, it disrupts the team's gelling process. And what I have found personally is success in which you have rapid growth periods followed by these consolidation or gelling periods. And typically, to summarize the strategy that I recommend is that you rapidly hire multiple people together into teams which are loaded by technical debt and also are understaffed, but not into innovating teams, because that is where you want to avoid incurring the regelling costs on high performing teams. And a better strategy if your team is innovating is to hire people one at a time rather than a bunch of people altogether. And having this sort of framework actually, helps me realize that when people do look at, okay, I need to hire, it's a good manager assessment framework that I think about to look at where the team is, what are the external signals that the team is giving out, which is something, that we very carefully orchestrate and manage within Postman, and looking at a combination of this to see when somebody comes back and says, okay, I need to hire a bunch of people, what does that mean? Okay, moving on to the second tool within hiring, the hiring conundrum, is identifying if the person is the right fit for my role. And I find it very, very useful to have the same framework that guides why you hire someone, also guiding how someone grows within the organization. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do. And based on everything that you have probably heard till now, you will understand why it works for Postman. And I cannot stress this enough. Like, this needs to be explicit, because if you have 15 people interviewing and you have not aligned on this, you'll probably hire 15 different types of people mirroring the personality of all of those people. Or you'll need to put in inefficient centralized checkpoints to control this, which is never sustainable. And I've learned this the hard way many, many times. So when I was thinking about the system thinking solution to this particular problem, I laid down the objectives that I wanted from that system, right? And I want to keep it just simple so that it's easy to communicate across skip levels, implement and review. It's consistent with how we hire, but also we grow. And you sort of extend the hiring funnel into how people grow within the organization. It's an entire continuum, much like how you think about, let's say, acquiring a customer, and how you think about, sales, marketing, transitioning to sales, transitioning to customer success and support. It's pretty much the same funnel when I think about hiring itself. A system obviously needed to be effective, which promoted the right behaviors that I mentioned when I was talking about our values that the company wanted to instill within the team, and also something that is observable so that the right loops can be introduced and evaluated on a regular cadence. So, and then the second thing to look at is that what does growth, or what do levels mean within an organization, right? I mean, I've seen lots of organizations where you have, software engineer, senior software engineer, lead, sometimes 7 different versions of this. What do they mean? And, for me, as I'm the one who always questions the why. Like, when I started thinking about this from what this meant for Postman, and like, am I copying the what of some other organization without understanding the why? And the reason why, the way I started reasoning about this is through this whole construct of scope of influence. So in my opinion, as folks advance in their careers, their duties should encompass a higher degree of complexity, the scope of their influence should expand, and the contribution should become more impactful. And it is important to define and make explicit what the expected behaviors are within the scope of influence for any given level. And why you hire someone. I mean, so again, something that I wanted to be very clear about, when I communicate this with the rest of the organization, when they are looking for certain signals. And I started bucketing that why into these 3 things. Values, which is alignment with our core values, alignment with the technical and the vocational aspects of the role, of course, and also alignment with leadership aspects for both managers and ICs. And I've seen a lot of organizations do the technical and only do the technical. And I feel that's ineffective, because you may be finding somebody who may be good at writing code, but may not be the right value fit, or may not be thinking about how they become a leader in the organization. And I mean, I strongly believe that leadership is not the same as management, and both individual contributors and managers need to exhibit good leadership. Management is more about being concerned with making sure that the projects are successful and the teams form good working relationships together, while leadership is about providing a clear and compelling direction to follow. So to do this, what we do is that we create these rubrics which outline competencies within each of these three buckets and with a strong description. And also, if you look at the columns, right, at each level, what exactly do we look for within this rubric? And by having these clearly outlined rubrics, we also have at least 2 interviewers across the thoughtfully designed interview process, evaluate each component of that rubric to eliminate any biases. And by doing this, we eliminated the need for any culture round or HR round or fitment round, which I've never really understood, because everybody in the organization should be evaluating for culture all the time. And this is how, by the way, values get further percolated within the company as well. Okay, last, and I'll quickly move to this, is creating a culture of learning. And I feel that innovative companies need that culture. And for us, this aligns very closely with our core value of create with curiosity. So I thought about this a lot, and I realized that, okay, there are 4 core skills that I find somebody needs to be effective at doing their job within Postman. Product thinking, analytical thinking, systems thinking, and cognitive psychology. And I've seen this over and over and over again, whether you are an engineer or a product guy or a marketing guy and so on. If you have the foundation in these 4 core skills, you will be able to do your job better. And for most roles in the organization, we actually keep these 4 books as mandatory reading for people to do. And secondly, we also created a culture of experimentation. Anyone within Postman is welcome to run an experiment. Experiments may be of the process type. These are obviously not product experiments. Those go through review gates, but any process experiment or any system level experiment, you are welcome to do. In fact, managers are incentivized almost to experiment on process optimizations. And I've seen many teams evolve because of this. One of the things that, I'll just share a quick story. Like one of the things that I do personally, and I've been doing for the last 3 years, is that every Sunday night, before I go to sleep, I sort of ask myself this question, that what is, the fundamentally new thing that you learned this week? Not something that was an adaptation of something that you already knew, but something that had to be fundamentally new. And that was, I started following this and I realized that my own learning and my own growth started becoming a bit more exponential and exactly in the direction that I wanted it to be. So like, okay, now I see this working for me, but it took a certain level of, awareness, I guess. So how do you extend this to a specific team? So I ran this experiment with one of the teams. And at that point in time, I was the line manager for a data science team as well. And what I did was I made them forcibly write, okay, what is a new thing that you fundamentally learned this week, and send it over to me as part of the weekly updates. And people were obviously confused. Like, what is this? What do you mean fundamentally new? How do I go about doing that? And the way I followed up with that was that, every time somebody will share some short snippet, I'll give them more reading materials. I'll give them more books or frameworks or things to think about. And it took a few weeks, but I realized that over, let's say and in this case, it was 6 weeks, that people just started being a lot more effective. The team suddenly started seeing exponential growth in its ability to produce output. And most of the learning, by the way, was fairly diversified. It was not related to data science specifically. We were learning about psychology, about systems thinking, analytics, in some cases, just reading more and more. And the outcome of this thing was that the team actually started doing like a book club within the team. And it was awesome because, a lot of my learning itself got compounded because every week I'll get this beautiful summary, or every month I'll get this beautiful summary of a book that the team has read and a summary of it. And they'll explain me what are the new things that they learned. And I ended up learning like 3 or 4 more things every week because of what the team was learning. And so we run a bunch of these kind of experiments and encourage managers to do that constantly. And we share this with the rest of the organization on a public channel. And as we grow, obviously, we'll introduce metrics to track, the success of these experiments and the proliferation itself. Okay, so in conclusion, right, what are the lessons that I would like to promote here, right? So the first thing is, I feel very important, ties back to the golden circle, right? You may have heard a lot of things from me as well. Not sure if you found them effective yet, but do not replicate what I said or how I said it without understanding the why, or anything else that you see or any company that you look up to. Always understand why somebody did that thing. When we looked at Spotify, for example, we understood why Spotify model worked. And they never mentioned domain-driven design or the whole idea of why this thing came up to place. It was applied to our unique context. Secondly, embrace constraints. Constraints are good. And when you look at a problem statement and you understand what constraints you're currently facing, the constraints lead to you to come up with an effective solution at that point in time. And it's important to look at certain signals or inflection points, because the constraints itself may evolve or loosen, or you have the ability to loosen some constraints to come up with better solutions. And all of this makes sense if you think in terms of how this impacts the end consumer and how you can make them better at their job. So you combine all these things together, you will realize the power and the beauty of constraint. Constraint is a positive word, not a negative one. Experiment, measure, iterate. Identify your own unique context and your own unique solution. Do not assume that you will get the same results with your different cultural foundation. Kind of the thing that I mentioned, right? That any structures that you may be emulating or looking into, structures are isomorphic with the culture. And if you don't have a culture, or if you have an ill-defined culture, the structures will probably be unpredictable, for the lack of a better phrase, if I could think about it. So always think about this. Finally, systems, any system that you design, it survives 1 to 2 orders of magnitude of growth, whether it's a technical system and you double your users, or whether it's a cultural system or an organizational system where you double or 10x the number of people that exist in the organization. And as a founder or as a leader within the organization, it's important to identify the inflection points and be willing and ready to evolve. Create with curiosity. Always reward and create structures within the organization where you incentivize diversity of ideas and innovation. And finally, the most important thing that I think I have learned over the last 5 years is fall in love with the problem statement and not the solution that you come up with. That's one of the biggest fallacies that I have seen people, or traps that I've seen people fall into. Okay, cool. So thank you so much for your time. I know I'm like 3 minutes over, but I hope this was useful. And I highly recommend that you go through the many references that I've included. These are fantastic books from which I have learned a lot. And I guess I'll be around questions that you may have. So stop sharing now.
The number of questions that came your way, Ankit. First of all, fascinating conversation and talk. Thank you so much. Really love the idea that, don't borrow the what and how without really understanding the why. Very, very well said. Thank you so much for that. So going through the list of summarizing, I think the top ask is people want your bookmark list. That's priceless.
I'll do that. Definitely, I'll do that. Yeah.
The book list, and there is an ask about your slide deck. Can it be shared? So I'm trying to combine all three.
Yeah.
Are you okay to share your slide deck?
Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, let me know wherever I have to send this across, and I'll do that.
Yeah, but I think to Tarun or I, if you send the deck, that'd be great.
I'll do that.
So if you can add any of the reading recommendations beyond what you have already mentioned, that's the second top ask. And I think the third one is too much to ask. Share your bookmark list. I guess that's
right. I'll include, as much as it's an ongoing journey. Like you end up learning, like, as I said, every week, something new. So I'll definitely share whatever at least I have.
That would be fantastic. That's actually number one ask from multiple people. The second one is, again, I'm grouping the questions here. People really have a number of questions around the squad model that you mentioned.
Okay. Yeah.
Wanted to understand a bit more. That includes, how do you structure that? Can you take it, walk us through that with a concrete example?
Yeah.
How do you conflict there? What's the size of a squad? All of that related questions.
Yeah, no, I think a really good point, right? So, and that's usually like a big talk because there's a lot of, things that led us to the solution, and it's hard to cover that. So today I wanted to keep it slightly broad and not deep so that, at least some of these ideas could be, subsequently followed upon. So if we talk about squads, right? So the first thing that I mentioned is breaking up the domain-driven design construct was actually very important because you broke up the number of problems that you're solving for, because we were kind of like found ourselves in a position where everybody was solving for everything. The way that we were structured, even within engineering, we had three, sort of layers at that point in time: product engineering, microservices engineering, and platform engineering. And which basically meant that, fundamentally, the person who was probably solving for, one part of the app and working on, let's say, Postman's unit testing platform or integration testing platform was also at the same time working on our monitoring tool. And, but the thing was that, people were definitely getting better at their technical skills, but not necessarily realizing what end user problems that they were solving for. And that is what we wanted to achieve, right? So it actually was something that a lot of different things. It started from my perspective with, looking at that microservices architecture and the struggles that we had with doing that thing, which, if I have to be really honest about it, and I don't know how many folks are engineers, but if I had to go back and do that, I probably would not have gone back and done that back in 2014. But I'm glad we did, because all the problems that we faced there, we actually found solutions for that and built that into the Postman product. So it's kind of like a hard thing to look into. Anyway, so while we looked at that, it also what we realized from Abhinav's side is that, people were definitely, getting better at technical constructs, but not taking better product decisions, or not taking those product decisions, automatically. And I feel that we were not communicating, or did not have the right structures to communicate the why within the organization. So by creating these sort of focus areas, where the focus areas were actually modeled around, business concerns and not technical concerns, the teams themselves started getting better at taking better product decisions, because you didn't need to actually have very complex or large volume product documents. You actually just had people who knew what they had to do, and then engineers that took the decision and actually built the product. And that is how we actually increased our agility by a lot. So in terms of a squad, right? So we create that cross-functional team, and it's something that's evolved, because obviously when we started out, we were a very small team. So when we started the squad model, we had about, I want to say about 40 odd people in engineering, which was about 2019 last year. And right now we're at about 110. So when we looked at that evolution, it pretty much tripled since then, right? So at that point in time, we sort of created this constraint that we wanted people to have one focus area that they do, which meant that a lot of times we had teams that were also like not completely full. And that was hard for me, because I had to kind of bridge the gap between multiple teams, get them both the business support and the technical support. But we realized that this was a good direction that we wanted to take and head towards. So at this point in time, now if I look at it, and I look at this metric called weighted fill ratio, which is how many people that I want in every single team at any point in time. And currently what we aspire for is basically, one engineering manager, one product manager, one dedicated designer, one product marketing guy, and not one solutions engineer just yet. And all of these guys allocated, plus 8 engineers across 3 levels of hierarchy with, impact, and look at that to compose a team. So if in effect, the team would probably be around 12 to 14 people right now.
Okay. When you said 12 people organized in a hierarchy, can you elaborate on that? Were you referring to report into who kind of thing? Oh,
interesting. So I think, so it's kind of like a matrix model. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm very bad with classical management structures. Okay, let me think of a better way to do it. So we have these, I guess like functions. So we have these functional organizations. So for engineering specifically, the engineering part of the team actually has a dedicated engineering manager who reports into that squad itself. So that engineering manager is responsible for that one team right now. And all of those 8 engineers reports into that engineering manager. But the product manager itself goes and reports back into the product function, which is also true of the engineering function, because what we also do is this concept that we didn't cover today is this idea of first teams. So in my opinion, like for engineering managers, the first team is probably not that team that you're leading, but your peers, much like how you have product managers as your peers or designers as your peers. So they all go back and report to those folks, but engineers itself, we decide to specifically focus on that within the squad itself. And by the way, this is something that I guess is unique to organizations. Spotify, like I had mentioned, actually do it very differently. So in Spotify, the engineering is actually also sort of follows this distributed model.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I take 2 more questions. How are we doing on time, Gautami?
We are past the time, Sreedhar, like 10 minutes past, but I think, do you want to take one more question and then leave it on the chat? People have a lot of questions.
Yeah, one more question, and after that you can look at the chat, Ankit.
Yeah, okay.
So the question was interesting. It was around the vision and constraints that you're talking about. And you also mentioned about embracing constraints. So there's a question around, can you explain with an example?
Right. And that's a hard one usually, it comes back to what is actually holding you back. Like if I look at the organization constraint, right now. So what is the constraint that I would have within Postman? Maybe not enough engineering leaders. That's a constraint that's holding me back, that we probably cannot, look at scaling the organization to the level that we wanted to, right? Now, if let's take this specific one, right? Like, okay, at this point in time, we have a lot of, line managers, engineers, but not a lot of people who are at the, that level of hierarchy within the organization for multiple reasons. Now, if I had to look at that as a constraint and design a solution around it, would I probably have all of these people reporting into me and have like a more leadership-based approach towards guiding them rather than managing them, right? Is kind of like the solution to that particular problem. Or you go about hiring, these hierarchical directors of engineering, which is another approach that you could take. And honestly, these are different approaches like you could take to solving that particular problem. So yeah, so again, it depends on your unique construct, but that is, I would say, what the constraint for me is right now. But when I talked about now, these are the constraints that you have right now. Now, assume that you were to solve for this constraint. Now, for the next level of evolution, which is what comes under future constraints, what would constrain me next to go and, achieve our mission of, solving these problems for 100 million developers in the world? And that is what, when you start reasoning out that vision document for the engineering function, that would be the section that I would write out here.
Fantastic. So with that, we come to the end of the questions, and a lot of people in the audience wanted to clap, showing the mark of appreciation. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate this. Okay.
You can see the gallery view, Ankit. You can see.
Yeah, I can. This is. Thank you so much. Wow.
Yeah. I think one more thing for everyone. Thank you, Ankit, for joining us today. I know you've not been well since yesterday, and you've still kept you've agreed to keep your promise and come and share this time and share your insights. So Ankit wasn't well yesterday, he was down with fever, and still he managed. And I can see that people are still saying it's such a passionate talk, right? And I think it still shows. Thank you so much, Ankit.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was awesome.
Thank you again.